First of all, I would like to thank the Liberation War Museum, in particular, Naureen and Mufidul and Imran for organizing this course and for allowing me to be part of it. I am delighted and honored. The topic assigned to me is most challenging. First, it's a question of history. And we know that history is so fraught, so contested, so radically polarized, that one begins to wonder if there is any such thing as history at all, or is there just versions of history, a his history and a her history, a black history and a white history, a colonizer's history and a colonized history, a Hindu history and a Muslim history. In our case, the matter becomes more complicated by the fact that we are dealing with events that are so intense, so horrific, so brutal, that objectivity becomes difficult. Just think about it. In 1947, during that partition, more than 1 million people were killed, 75,000 women were raped, 12 million people were forcibly displaced out of their ancestral domiciles. Can you imagine the trauma, the displacement, the emotional struggles that generated? And how do we reconstruct or tell that story? Given the subversions and treacheries of memory, how reliable is memory in terms of reconstructing and telling that story? Is remembering a political act? What do we choose to forget? What do we choose to nurture? I am myself a child of the partition, and I remember from my parents how difficult it was for some of them, for my parents, for example, to just recall the partition days. They just did not want to talk about it. Thus, in this fine tension between the individual need to forget and the collective need to remember, how is memory configured and textualized? More importantly, to what extent do our current circumstances influence, prompt, and shape our memories? We must understand that it is not just our past that determines our present. It is also our present that defines our past. That's why historiography becomes so selective and politically charged. We used to say that knowledge is power. Nowadays, we're beginning to realize that power is knowledge, because through it, it determines who controls the narrative, who dominates the text, who molds the national consciousness, which determines our perception of history. To return to our topic of conversation today, those are just very preliminary observations I had. But to return substantively to the discussion, since we're not dealing with a personality or a discrete event or a precise moment in history, but with historical evolution, the question arises, where should I begin? If we have to understand the 1947 partition, we have to begin obviously with the British and their role in determining our social structure and our political evolution. And there are 3 moments that I think are particularly relevant in terms of that impact it had on our social structure and our political narrative that developed. The first was the Permanent Settlement Act of 1793, which the British thought was simply making land revenue more efficient and more rational and easier, but which had the unintended consequence of leading to a new structure of land ownership in the country and the communalization of class relations. In other words, most of the new zamindars and the new landed classes were essentially the newly rich, the no-rich Hindu members of the community. Most of the poor peasantry turned out to be Muslim. And therefore, class conflict was gradually superimposed upon a communal conflict. The second was the first census in India, 1881, which led to the conscious institutionalization of social and communal divisions. It forced people to identify themselves as Hindu or Muslim or Sikhs or Jains. It disrupted the moral economy of the peasantry. And in the process, this distinctiveness and this othering became very specific and numerical. If you read Hunter's, the Indian Muslimans, you will get a sense of the way in which they tried to create this notion of separation that existed between the communities. The third event was the partition of Bengal in 1905, which could be considered to be a cunning ploy to divide and conquer, or a more manageable, a reasonable decision to make the administration more manageable. It was annulled 6 years later, but it left behind a residue of resentment and suspicion that made the alienation of the communities much more concrete, much more sharp, and much more obvious. What I'm merely pointing out is that the Hindus and Muslims, whose lives had for long been intertwined and overlapping, gradually these bonds began to unravel and they became more separate and more distant. I'm not sure that the British were responsible for all this, but they certainly created the enabling conditions for this to happen. And our political leadership at the time, not only did they not challenge it, they used it for their own political advantage. Was Pakistan, or the partition of 1947, was that inevitable? Was it necessary to happen? Could it have been avoided? If it was inevitable, when did it become so? I would like to argue that there was one decade in which the notion of Pakistan became the reality of Pakistan. And this decade was earmarked by two elections. These are the elections of 1936-37 and the elections of 1946-47. What happened? In the 1936-37 elections, there were 482 seats for Muslims. The Muslim League won only 106, which means less than 25%. In the Muslim majority provinces, they were nowhere. In Punjab, out of 175 seats, the Muslim League won only 2. In Sindh, out of 60 seats, they won 0. In Bengal, out of 250 seats, they won only 37. So the Muslim League in the 1936-37 elections was almost wiped out. The only places where it did well were in the Muslim minority provinces. And that's because there were fewer parties there were regional moorings, the leadership were much more adept, and therefore in the Muslim minority provinces, the Muslim League got a lot of the votes. But think what happened in 1946, just 10 years later. Well, I should point out that both these elections were held on the basis of the Act of 1935, which created what we call separate electors. That is, Muslims voted for the Muslims, Hindus voted for the Hindus. In the 1946 elections, the Muslim League won more than 85% of the seats allocated to them. In Bengal, more than 90%. So what happened in 10 years? How is it that from less than 25% of the seats, now the Muslim League gets more than 90% of the seats? What are the things that drove this particular juncture in history in this particular direction? I personally think that there are 3 things that happened that led to this. First, Congress seriously miscalculated and therefore did not agree to the seat or power sharing arrangements in the 1936-37 elections. They were led by the logic of numbers. They could argue that Muslim League, why should we share power with you? You got only less than 25% of the seats. And the Muslim League claimed much more. Jinnah, if you know, as you all know, I'm sure, was a typical Karachi businessman's environment. That's what he lived in. So he believed in a very bargaining culture. I will ask for more, hoping that they will give us something. But on the other side was Patel, who was also a Gujarati Baniya. And he spoke the same language as well. What I'm saying, guys, is that in the 1936-37 election, the negotiations took place in terms of sharing power, broke down completely as a result of misunderstandings both in terms of the Congress and in terms of the Muslim League, who expected much more. I should tell you one thing here that I think is rather interesting. The Congress decision was logically correct. They could say, you won 25% of the votes, less than 25. Why should we give you 1/3 of the seats in the assembly? You did not win any of the Muslim majority states. Why should we allow you some kind of inclusion in those administrations? So statistically, Congress was right. But this is one of those conditions where statistical logic leads you to unwise decisions. Let me give you just one famous example of this, guys. All of you are familiar with it. In 1948, the UN partition plan of Palestine gave the Palestinians 48% of the land and the Israelis 52% of the land. The Palestinians claimed legitimately that, wait a minute, we are 67% of the population. Why are we being given only 48% of the land? Very correct. But they did not understand the impact of the Holocaust, Western guilt, the preparation that the Jews had already made, the incredible military weaponry that they have been able to assemble. They did not take into consideration any of these factors. And today, the Palestinians are fighting for only 22% of what had been offered to them in 1948. Statistically correct, but politically unwise. This negotiation broke down after the 36-37 election. The second thing that happened was the Second World War. And the reason this is important for us is because of two things. First, Congress did not support the war effort, and therefore most of the leadership were jailed. They were hounded. They could not give up their Quit India movement unless Britain agreed to a specific date of their independence. Jinnah, on the other hand, and the Muslim League supported the war effort. And therefore, Jinnah, who had left the country after the 37th election, he had left the country. He was reinvited by the British, and he suddenly became a great leader again. He became, in Aisha Jalal's phrase, the Muslims' sole spokesman. So the Second World War also had a role to play in what happened in that particular decade. The third thing that happened was, even though it was small scale and localized, nonetheless, there was violence that we saw between the communities. Certainly in Punjab, a little smattering of it in Bengal. But this merely reinforced the kind of misunderstandings. I should tell you guys that it is so much easier, the mobilization of hate is so much easier than the construction of understanding. And at that moment, politicians realized that we have to address our local communal concerns and not go for the larger, more humanitarian issues that were relevant at the time. So all of these three things, the breakdown of the negotiation in 36-37, the Second World War, and the small scale but nonetheless important violence that was occurring between the communities, all of this led to the final decision for the partition of the land. Was good Pakistan have continued to exist? Or was it created in a way that it was doomed to failure from the very beginning? We don't know. These are some of the historical imponderables. These are the counterfactuals of history. We just don't know what would have happened. If Pakistan had a different kind of leadership, would the situation have been different? We don't know. What we do know are the realities that we had to face, which were incredible cultural callousness on their part. For example, in terms of language, in terms of our understanding or embrace or appreciation of Rabindranath, or music. They would not allow Poila Boishak. Even what a woman wears becomes communalized. So if you wear a teep, somehow that becomes Hindu. If you wear a sari, that becomes Hindu. So this was the kind of a callousness that we were seeing being demonstrated by the leadership, by the Pakistani leadership. at that time. Second was the political arrogance. To most of the Pakistani leadership elite at that time, numbers did not matter. The Bangladeshis were obviously the majority of the population. They simply did not have the majority in the legislature. And of course, in administration, military, and the important services, their presence was almost negligible. Even constitutions did not matter. The first constitution took 9 years to make and 2 years to break. So it came into effect in 1956. It was abrogated in 1958. So we could have had the rule of law. We could have had constitutional government, but that was not provided that opportunity. And the third thing that happened, apart from cultural callousness and a political arrogance, was economic exploitation. This was systematic, this was structural, this was brutal. The Pakistan elite had brought into the Huntington's argument of development first, democracy later. But the pursuit of that development led to incredible growth in one part of the country and incredible inequality in the other. So the two economy theses that we saw being presented by Professor Rahman Subhan, Nurul Islam, and the others had such clarity about it because it told us very, very obviously what the situation was and how it was developing. That we were the greater earner of foreign exchange, but the larger amount of development money went to the other wing of the country. How is that acceptable? How is that fair? How is that politically justified? And so gradually we began to understand for cultural, political, and of course, economic reasons, we began to understand that this simply would not be able to survive. What is it in the 1960s that created the momentum, that gave us the inspiration, that created the energy for this thing to continue to that final denouement in 1971? Again, three things were relevant. First, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. There is simply no denying the fact that his emergence as a charismatic leader, he towered over everybody else, both physically, politically, and psychologically. His passion, his persona, his organizational skills. I should tell you guys that we should not merely look at Bangabandhu in terms of the speech, the March 7th speech, and his great and rousing capacity for making very inspiring and very emotional speeches. He was a brilliant, I think that speech, I was in the race course Maidan myself. I cannot tell you the impact it had. So there is absolutely no denying the fact that as a speaker, he was one of the most effective. I would gladly compare him to the greatest orators of all times. But it wasn't merely that. There was another aspect to Bangabandhu that sometimes we miss because we are so mesmerized by his speaking abilities, and that is his organizational skills. He went from province to province, from village to village, building up the Awami League leadership, making sure that there was a connection, making sure that organizationally there was rationality, there was accountability, there was coherence in terms of the way in which the party was being gradually built. Of course, there were other leaders, Tajuddin Ahmed, Mansoor Ali, Nazrul Islam, and so many others who were also part of that same process of party building and consolidation and mobilization and so on. But I would like to contend that without Bangabandhu, that process would have been much more difficult and much more complex. The second thing that happened that propelled us in that direction in the 60s was the 60s itself. This is difficult for some of you in this generation to understand what it meant for us at that time to be alive. As you know, that dawn of history, we were just simply thrilled to be alive at that moment, both internationally as well as here in our own country. We honestly felt the 1960s. I became a student of the university in 67. I passed my matric in 65 and joined the college in 65. We honestly felt in the 60s that we could change the world. We saw what was happening around us. We all believed that we could correct its injustices, end its oppressions, finish its hatreds, conquer its hatreds. We all believed that. And not just in our country, throughout the world we believed that. There was Daniel Cohn-Bendit and Tariq Ali and Stokely Carmichael, the great leader, Huey Newton, the great leaders of that time, the student leaders of that time, who led us to believe that, yes, we are not the objects of history. We are the subject of history. We can change history. We can make history. And we were inspired by that message. So it was not only what the Pakistanis did or the incredible leadership qualities of Bangabandhu. It was also the spirit of the times that led us in that particular direction and gave us the confidence, gave us the inspiration, hope, the vision, the dream that yes, we can do whatever it is we had wanted. And in this, I would like to point out the centrality of the universities almost everywhere. It is university students who were at the forefront of these struggles. Think about the crisis of capitalism that we saw in the 60s. Think about the militarism. Think about Vietnam and Algeria. Think about the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65. Think about the fact the first environmental movement beginning in 1967. Think about the first women's magazine that was built, that was created in 1968. So there was an incredible degree of change that was occurring throughout the world. And in the universities, we saw this most clearly, most inspirationally, and most effectively. We were so proud to be part of the 60s generation and trying to make what we could of that. The Bangladesh project, therefore, fell right in to that hope that we had in terms of correcting historical injustices and historical mistakes. Of course, we had, like in other parts of the world, we ourselves also had incredible student leaders. I will not name them, but from almost all parties. There were Chapter Union and Chapter League and so many other different parties. They were incredibly powerful and dedicated and completely given to the purpose, the objectives that they had set for themselves. They were very unlike, I don't want to belittle this generation, but the leadership at that time were very unlike some of what we see in some of the stories that we hear. The third thing that happened in the 60s was the cycle of 1970. Nothing proved the incompetence and the insensitivity of the Pakistani ruling elite than their response to that tragedy. We were appalled. We were, first of all, saddened at the tragedy of 1970, the cyclone that we saw. But we were appalled by what they did and what they said, the decisions they made, and the indifference that they had displayed. So when the first national election of Pakistan occurred in 1970, the Bangladeshis voted with their heart. And the vast majority of the seats, certainly in East Pakistan, went to the Awami League, which, as we understood it, was the party, the champion of political independence and liberation of the country. I think I have 3 more minutes. Before I conclude, I'd like to make 2 very quick points. Can I do that, Naureen? Can I have 3 more minutes?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. First, I would like to point out the political maturity of the Bengali population. Quite incredible, quite remarkable. For example, in the 1936-37 election in Bengal, they voted not with the Muslim League, not with Congress, but with the Krishak Praja Party, Sher Bangla's party, because that was the right thing to do. That was their voice. That was their message. That was their vote. In the 1946 election, they voted for Pakistan. More than 82% of Muslims. That was exactly the right thing to do at that time, given the circumstances that they were facing. In 1954, they rejected that whole idea and voted for Jukta Front. In 1970, they made exactly the right decision and voted for the Army League. The point I'm driving towards is that we belittle the people of our own country because they're not all very well educated and they are too politically passionate and so on and so forth. And they can be easily misled, but at the same time, given the opportunity, they have always shown their political maturity and their ability to make the right decision. Before I conclude, one last question. History should not be emotionalized or sentimentalized. History is not a conclusion. It is a process of discovery based on empirical evidence, logical soundness, and reasonable assumptions. So we must always be willing to question, to scrutinize, to examine conclusions and explanations that people give us. This is how knowledge is actually enhanced. So if people take away your right to question, because I think this is the right thing to do, or you must believe this, then at that moment, the scholarly aspect of the historical project suffers. Whether we can rise beyond our narrow interests and really engage with our history remains our hope and our challenge. Thank you all. Thank you very much. If there are any questions.
Thank you so much, Professor.
I finished right on time, Ma?
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much. So we now move on to the question answer session. So if the participants have any question, please ask directly to the speaker.
Can you hear me?
Please,
Hello.
Hello, Beta, could you identify yourself?
Yeah, just Arifuzzaman, can you just say your name and
thank you.
designation?
Thank you, Professor Ahrar sir. I'm from Center for Genocide Studies, University of Dhaka. I introduced before you have joined third international conference on genocide and mass violence in Dhaka University. I communicated with you, but I don't want to elaborate this one. I just want to ask a question. Many scholars who have always tried to ask something about the 1947 partition as a genocidal relation. Do you have seen any symptoms that this 1947 partition lead a genocidal intent in the history of the world?
That word, Beta, could you say that again? What?
Sir, বাংলায় যদি বলি যে 1947 সালের যে দেশ বিভাগ, সেই দেশ বিভাগটাকে অনেকে বলে থাকেন যে এটা জেনোসাইডের একটা অংশ হতে পারে বা এটাও একটা জেনোসাইড, যে 1971 এর পরে প্রায় 1 মিলিয়ন পিপল বা তারও বেশি মানুষ রিফিউজি হয়েছিল, স্টেটলেস হয়েছিল। সেই ক্ষেত্র থেকে আসলে স্যার এটা কি জেনোসাইডের একটা অংশ হতে পারে 1947 partition?
Right, but if you look at the numbers only, yes, it did appear to be genocidal in terms of its impact, in terms of the kind of suffering it generated. Kintu genocide also implies a kind of self-conscious application of power, of force to eliminate others. It all evolved out of a very complex set of circumstances. And there were, I hate to say this, but both sides participated in this fratricidal violence that we see. So yes, its impact was genocidal, but in terms of the organization and practice, it was not, we cannot call it a genocide in the way in which we usually use the word. Come on, Vita.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Actually, এটা অনেক কেউ 1947 নিয়ে আসলে খুব বেশি গবেষণা আমরা দেখি না, তো এটা আমাদের কাছে অনেক বেশি একটা কিউরিয়াস ম্যাটার, যেটা স্যার আপনি সর্বশেষ বিষয় দিয়ে শেষ করলেন যে হিস্ট্রি শুড নট বি ইমোশনালাইজ, এটা প্রুফের উপর ডিপেন্ড করে বলা উচিত। 1947 নিয়ে আসলে খুব বেশি রিসার্চ না হওয়ার কারণে এটা অনেকেই জেনোসাইডাল ইন্টেন্ট হিসেবে দেখানোর চেষ্টা করে বা করে থাকে, সেই জন্য আমার প্রশ্নটি।
Right, but it has always surprised me and disappointed me that that the Bengalis have been so indifferent to the 1947 partition. If you think about it better, the Punjabis have been so much more engaged. They have produced a scholarship that is so much more richer, so much more objective, so much more acceptable. We did not, apart from some memory, down memory lane. I remember we had such a big house and we had 4 cows. Apart from stories like that, the partition, the analysis, judgment, and the factors and forces of the partition, from the perspective of Bangladesh or Bengalis, has not received the kind of attention that it deserves. I hope that we will be able to unravel those complexities at some time. Because I honestly believe that unless we understand 47, I don't think our understanding of 71 can be complete. So we have to incorporate that story as part of the historical narrative that we would like to weave.
Thank you, sir.
Certainly.
Any more question?
Yes, I have.
Oh, thank you, Ma Naureen. That's so sweet of you.
Okay, Arman, you have a question?
Yes.
Can you say it a bit loud?
Yeah.
Okay.
So আপনি বলেছিলেন 1947 এর পূর্বে কংগ্রেস অথবা মুসলিম লীগের মধ্যে একটা শেয়ারিং ক্ষমতা কমে গিয়েছিল, সেজন্য দেশভাগ হওয়ার একটা পসিবিলিটি বেড়ে গিয়েছিল। ঠিক তেমনি পাকিস্তানের সময়ও পাকিস্তান আমাদের সাথে সেম সমস্যা করেছিল, শেয়ারিংটা করে নাই। আপনি এক্সাম্পল দিয়েছেন প্যালেস্টাইন সেম কাজটা করেছিল।
Arman, we are not hearing you clearly.
একটু জোরে বলবে বেটা?
আচ্ছা, আমি বলতে চাচ্ছি 1947 এর পূর্বে কংগ্রেস বনাম মুসলিম লীগের মধ্যে শেয়ারিংটা কমে গিয়েছিল, আপনি যেটা বলেছিলেন।
হ্যাঁ,
ঠিক তেমনি 1947 এর পরে পাকিস্তান এবং বাংলাদেশের মধ্যে সেই সমস্যাটা হয়েছিল। আপনি যেমনটা এক্সাম্পল দিয়েছিলেন প্যালেস্টাইন সেই সমস্যাটা করেছিল, ওরা শেয়ারিং ক্ষমতাটা বুঝে না যে শেয়ারিং এর জন্য শেয়ারিং করলে ব্যাপারটা কিরকম দাঁড়াতো। প্রশ্ন হচ্ছে যদি শেয়ারিং হতো তখন ব্যাপারটা কিরকম দাঁড়াতো। আর আপনি কিছু এক্সাম্পল দিতে পারেন যে পৃথিবীতে এইরকম শেয়ারিং করে কেউ খুব সুন্দরভাবে ইতিহাসটা কন্টিনিউ করতে পেরেছে।
Right. Therefore, the question is, could Pakistan have continued as a country if the leadership had been a little more willing to share power and economic benefits, yes, and so on?
Yes, sir.
Excellent question. Very good. And the answer is, I don't know. এগুলোকে আমরা বলি বেটা, these are the counterfactuals of history. যেখানে what if they had done this, যদি ওরা এটা করতো, যদি এই সিদ্ধান্তটা হতো, যদি ওটা না করতো। ওই যদির সমস্যাগুলো বেটা যে they are based on assumptions, on speculations, যেগুলো আমাদের পক্ষে প্রমাণ করা খুব ডিফিকাল্ট হয়ে যায়। কেমন? যে কারণে as evocative as they may be, as reasonable as they may sound, from a very scholarly perspective, they do not acquire the same kind of legitimacy. হ্যাঁ, এটা নিশ্চয়ই যে হয়তো পাকিস্তানি লিডারশিপ যদি একটু অন্যরকম হতো, যদি ওদের মনস্তত্ত্বটা অন্যরকম হতো, যদি ওরা আমাদেরকে একটু অন্যরকম ভাবে দেখতো, তাহলে নিশ্চয়ই হয়তো অন্যরকম হতে পারতো। কিন্তু given the fact that we had created a country which was a geographic monstrosity, যেখানে কোনো কালচারাল বন্ডস ছিল না, যেখানে কোনো মেমোরিজ অফ হিস্ট্রি ও পর্যন্ত এক ছিল না, আমাদের ইতিহাসের চিন্তাও এক ছিল না, সেই দেশটাকে এক হিসেবে গড়ে তোলার জন্য যেই ধরনের উইজডম আর যেই ধরনের স্যাক্রিফাইস আর যেই ধরনের ম্যাচিউরিটি দরকার ছিল লিডারশিপের, Obviously, Pakistan did not have that. Come on. So, yes, it was a failure of negotiation, but it was a failure of negotiation that was preceded by various cultural and economic forces that took it in that particular direction. Good question, Beta. Very good question. Thoughtful. Very thoughtful.
So we can receive one last question for this session. So any one of you?
Can I ask a question, please?
Yeah, Sadia, go on.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum, sir. I am
Welcome.
Sadia Naureen from Law Department of University of Borishal. So this session was very much impactful and resourceful. Thank you for that.
You, ma'am.
At least I have a comment, actually, not a question, that is if it can be true or not, that the religious view and perception of the leaders, the political leaders of that time, from 1947 to 1971, has whether it has turned actually the luck of the nation, their religious view and their perception. Mainly, whenever I have learned about the history, I found that the religious view and their perception great impact or large impact in every struggle or in every movement. So is that true or not, that the political leaders have somehow a narrow-minded religious view or perception, and because of that all this movement or the struggles the nation has to face? Is that true or not, or am I correct or not, please?
Thank you, Ma Sadia. Thank you. And thank you for your very generous, gracious comments. Ma, this is a very, very complex question. Come on. Largely because the way, not because of what religion is, but because of the way it has been used by people throughout history as well as in our own country. ধর্মের যে উদারতা, ধর্মের যে সহমর্মিতা, ধর্মের যে সেন্স অফ জাস্টিস, এইগুলো যদি আমরা ভুলে গিয়ে শুধু আমার ধর্মে এই, তোমার ধর্ম ওই, আমি এটা করি তুমি ওইটা করো, তোমার সঙ্গে আমার কোনো মিল নেই, শুধু তাই না, we begin to assume that you are not just different, you're not just the other, but that you are a threat to me. তোমার অস্তিত্ব আমাকে threaten করছে। তখন it becomes part of the environment of hate that we create. যেই ধর্ম হেটের বিরুদ্ধে কথা বলে, সেই ধর্মকেই আমরা হেটের পক্ষে, হেটের একটা, we make it a partner of hate because of the way in which our, as you pointed out, narrow-minded leadership look at it. Religion can be beautiful. It can be very, very uplifting. It can be very reassuring. It can be very aesthetic, but it can also be put to terrible use. Our tragedy has been, Ma Sadia, is that instead of looking at the beauty and the grace and the forgiveness and the mercy that religion can be, we have used it for political purposes and have therefore not been particularly true to its teachings or its inspirations.
Thank you, sir, for a nice and insightful lecture. So my question is that, like, what's your view that whether we can liable the Pakistan nation as a whole, or that particular Janta government which led the war in 1971? So is this the nation as a whole can be held liable for that war, or it's only like the government that led the war? And if it is it possible now to seek reparation for that particular, damage done by the Janta government? So what's your opinion on that?
Right. Two separate questions, Beta Farhad. Very good questions. First of all, whether Pakistan itself, its citizens, the country, can be held responsible for the tragedy of 1971, I personally don't think so. This is a very personal opinion of mine. It was more the egos and the interests of people like Bhutto and the Yahya Khan and the Tika Khans and the leadership at that time, who were so narcissistic, who were so desperate for power, who were so uncaring that they simply did not, were not sensitive to the needs, the claims, or the injustices that the Bangladeshis suffered. And so I would like to blame that particular leadership, that particular elite at that time, for who were responsible for this. The ordinary, normal, poor Pakistani peasant probably had very little idea of what was happening. Probably. I remember, in any case. So on the question of reparation, a much more difficult question, and the more we wait, the more difficult it becomes, because reparations involve certain mathematical computations, certain calculations, and it's very difficult to agree on exactly what the field is and what cost what and how much we are expecting and how much we will be giving. As we had indicated a little while back, we are not very good negotiators, Beta. We tend to be very, very poor in terms of understanding or in transacting, negotiating our points of view, making compromises. We are not very good at that. Given that fact, for us to go up to Pakistan and say, you must provide us with this reparations for the damages you've done, will be a very challenging enterprise. I would like to see it happen. I hope somebody comes up with a calculation and then presents it to the Pakistanis. I sincerely doubt. Don't expect the Mishti from Pakistan to come anytime soon.
Thank you so much, Professor, for giving your precious time to the participants. We hope that in our coming events and activities, we will be having you joining us and also interacting with the young generation.
Ma, after what the students will say about me after this, I don't think you want to invite me anytime again. But thank you very much. I'd like to thank all the students for their patience.
So kind of you, sir.
For very, very excellent questions and for allowing me this time with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.